Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to have been invited to present at this symposium. And I'm just so grateful because it's been such a gift of an opportunity to be here in person, to learn from all of you. And I wanted to express my thanks in particular to Urvashi, to Liza, to Sim, and for all their work in putting together this amazing event, and for bringing us together. And also to the wider team at RaceB4Race and ACMRS, to just all the members of the team who've supported this event and just made it as incredible as it's been. My paper today places pre-modern critical race studies and Shakespeare studies into contemporary concerns and critical conversations with Islamophobia, which is effectively the study of the racialization of Islam and anti-Muslim racism. My aim is to use the critical forces and methodologies of the two disciplines in order to consider the genealogies of early modern English race-making in our recent history. So there's going to be three parts to my discussion. I'll begin with an overview of some of the intellectual frameworks that guide my reading of Islam in the early modern world. I then examine the development of a key apparatus of Islamophobia in early modern England, or specifically late 16th century, early 17th century England. And that's the racialization of Islam in early modern English drama. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at The Merchant of Venice. And in the final part of this paper, I'll turn to the contemporary moment to consider how the early modern racialization of Islam is harnessed in contemporary acts of racial profiling, which operate in arenas of security, surveillance, policing, which have very tangible antagonistic effects for Muslims, very lived, tangible effects for Muslims. I wanted to make a brief note about the language I use in the title of this paper, and particularly my use of the word stranger. Stranger, as we know, in early modern England is a category that is used to describe foreignness, intermingled with obscurity and often difference. And so I use this term to encapsulate the foreignness of the Muslim subjects that I am thinking about in this paper, and particularly of the Prince of Morocco, who's the primary subject of my analysis, and who Portia's attendant refers to in the play as a stranger in an ostensibly innocuous manner. I use it too to evoke a history of travel associated with Muslim strangers in early modern England, especially since the policing around movement and travel, which we see in contemporary manifestations of Islamophobia, which manifests often in contemporary manifestations of Islamophobia. Additionally, however, in using this language, I really want to repurpose the way we think about the stranger, following in the suit of Ruben Espinosa, who does this in his essay Stranger Shakespeare, where he uses it to productively speak to the cultural and intellectual insights of Latino-Latina engagements with Shakespeare. I'm experimenting with this vocabulary here to draw on an Islamically rooted self-awareness of Muslim difference, one that enables a transformation of this terminology into a source of hope in the context of anxious realities and experiences of anti-racism. Abu Huraira, who is one of the primary recorders and transmitters of the Hadith, and these are the orally transmitted sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, narrates in a Sahih, or an authentic Hadith, that the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, said, "Islam began as something strange and will go back to being something strange. So glad tidings to the strangers." The Hadith registers the tensions, oppressions, and confusions which were attached to the early formation of Islam in pre-modern Arabia, but also looks forward in its recognition of a future where such discrimination against Muslims may rear its head again, and this is a future which doesn't take very long to materialize after the early years of Islam. The statement encourages the oppressed to hold their convictions and asks Muslims to celebrate the so-called differences that will be used against them. And so I use this term to recall the Prophet's identification of Muslims, to reconfigure the English categorization of strangers, and to write Islam and its principles back into the Muslim figure that Islamophobia seeks to raise, as I will explore in this paper. One of the great values of the theme of this conference is that it really has given speakers the opportunity and the space to acknowledge the intellectual traditions and the genealogies, the critical lineage that shapes our own scholarship. So like the other speakers who've appeared before me, I wanted to emphasize that the ideas I consider with you today benefits from and builds on the studies of the intellectual founders and the greats, the giants of pre-modern critical race studies, including Geraldine Heng, Kim Hall, Peter Erickson, Margot Hendricks, Anya Lumba, Ayanna Thompson, and those before them and working alongside them. I'm also seeking to engage with, and I seek to contribute really with the scholarship of critics like Ambreen Dadaboy and Jane Huang Degenhardt, who have done significant work to expand our critical understanding on the relationship between race and religion in the formation of 16th and 17th century English views of Islam. In Dadaboy's work in particular, she examines how Shakespeare's plays are made complicit in perpetuating the injustice of Islamophobia, both in the classroom and in the sphere of global Shakespeare performances and adaptations. My discussion hopes to add to these existing insights on the relationship between race and Islam with an attention to the strategies of racializing Muslims that operates not just by demonizing Muslims, but specifically by erasing Islam out of Muslim identity. This racialization, I will argue, creates a breeding ground for further acts of discrimination like racial profiling. There's a racial project at work in the England's historical denial of Muslim faith as part of the same theological lineage as Christianity and even as Judaism. Benedict Robinson gestures toward this in his study on Islam in early modern English Romance traditions, where he notes that Europe has always, quote, Europe has always refused to treat Islam as a religion at all, preferring to inscribe it into theories of racial, political, and cultural differences in order to fashion a coherent Europeanness. The critic supports his argument by referencing some of the vocabularies which have been used to historically refer to Muslims by another name: Turk, Saracen, Arab, and we could add to his list terms like Moor and even Malay, which is a category that Dutch colonizers will use in mid-17th century South Africa, and English colonizers later inherit this to refer to the Indonesian enslaved populations at the Cape of Good Hope. The systematic and deliberate nature of such erasure in the period is made visible by our awareness of the historical reality of the fact that Islam was not a mystery to the English. The early modern periods have been widely documented as a time of increased geographic mobility, as well as social, economic, political, and cultural exchanges between societies from around the world. And in this global context, Muslim rulers and peoples, including those from the powerful Ottoman, Mughal, Safavid, and Saudi dynasties, represented political allies, trading partners, intellectual sources, military enemies to the English, who were at this point a small, largely unnoteworthy nation. Nabil Matar's foundational work on this history of Anglo-Muslim encounter reveals the extent of interaction between these regions, but also the intimate ways in which the English would have engaged with Muslim identity, not least through the frequency with which Englishmen were converting to Islam. At the same time, Imtiaz Habib's prolific study on the notable population of Black people living in Shakespeare's England opens up the possibility that Black persons of Muslim heritage and perhaps faith were living amongst the English. Islamophobia studies is a disciplinary field which I believe should have a place in the branch of the critical family tree of pre-modern critical race studies, as it offers a useful vocabulary and lens through which to make sense of this racialization of Islam in the period, and particularly this erasure. The field emerged out of the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, his seminal study, but it's of course since been expanded beyond the parameters of the colonial period that Said explores. Scholars working across the global north and the global south have shown that our recent past has been fraught with global events of anti-Muslim discrimination, where this faith-based group is demonized on the grounds of aspects of identity, such as physical appearance, ethnicity, clothing, language, and nationality. And as Steve Garner and Sahar Sellet argue, quote, racialization is a concept that helps to capture and understand how this categorizing of Muslims works in different ways at different times and in different places. I'm interested in using the paradigms from Islamophobia studies, which is a very contemporary orientated discipline, to facilitate my reading of Islam in early modern drama and to trace this genealogy from past to the present. The Merchant of Venice is perhaps the most fitting text for this examining of these ideas, given its racialization of Jewishness. The race-based treatment of Jewish identity in the play, which is reflective of early modern England, was descended from a European discourse of race-making, one which, like Shakespeare's play, pits Muslims and Jews against Christians. I refer, of course, to Spain's 15th century legislation around limpieza de sangre, hope I said that correctly, or the cleanliness of blood, which used a fiction of blood purity to mark Jews and Muslims and Jews, or those of such heritage, as inferior to Christians. The Merchant of Venice expands on the pervasive racial ideology at the root of this 15th century Spanish practice and uses it to explore new technologies of difference-making in both racialized groups, in both religious groups, I mean. There is often some tentativeness among scholars to categorize the Prince of Morocco in Shakespeare's play as a Muslim, which is not surprising since the play makes virtually no explicit references to the prince's religious identity. The only allusion that appears to any religious deity in the context of his scene is in his invocation of some god. And according to the OED, the word some in the 16th century did not only refer to an undetermined one or other, but could also be an adjective used to indicate something specific. So some god could imply a specific god of the monotheistic religion as much as it could have conveyed a kind of paganism. But the absence of the particular religious categorizations of the prince is curious, considering how central religious difference is to the play as a whole. And yet, it doesn't take that much effort, I would argue, to discern that the prince is not a Christian. The play invites the audience to cognitively recognize that the prince's religious differences to the Christians in Belmont is very much a truth, and it manifests through his own language and the anxiety that his language reveals. In much the same way that the prince attempts to mitigate the differences of his dark skin color and his African blood by using what Ian Smith refers to as linguistic rationalizations in order to offer a solution to the disability of his difference, the prince similarly mobilizes rhetoric to convince Portia and her companions of his religious sameness. As Kim Hall observes, the prince frames his pursuit of Portia as a kind of religious pilgrimage. He uses phrases like blessed, cursed, heavenly, virgin, mortal, breathing saint, damnation, sinful, and angel, and these allow him to make an outward show of the knowledge of his Christian discourse and to signal his investment in the religious world of Belmont, as well as to his potential to be effectively integrated into this world. The prince's non-Christian identity unveils the character's insecurity about his spiritual state. Inevitably, the prince betrays his lack of theological understanding when he blasphemously characterizes Portia as an idol to be worshipped, demonstrating his ignorance of pivotal tenets of the monotheistic Christian faith. And in imagining Portia as an angel in a coin, he indicates that his knowledge has been derived from Belmont's religious identities and discourses has been derived through commerce. If the prince's failed pursuit of Portia confirms for the audience that the prince is necessarily a religious other, then the playwright establishes the religious differences of the Moroccan prince by using geographic and cultural signifiers of identity that enable the audience to mark the Muslim identity of the prince. That is where to mark at once denotes the process of rendering a stain or a visual code or a mark on the body that signifies religion, but simultaneously registers the racializing act of visual ordering as it's been categorized by Patricia Hakimi. As Hakimi asserts, marking represents a form of social judgment or scrutiny, one which equips certain privileged members of society with a lens through which to organize differences and establish outsiders and threats. The prince's Muslim signifiers are referenced in one short set of lines where the character attempts to prove his valor and strength to Portia by swearing by this scimitar that slew the Sophie and a Persian prince, that won 3 fields of Sultan Solomon, I would outsnare the sternest eyes that look. His assertion that he would outstare his competitors, who he earlier identifies as white northerners like the English, teases the English audience with a challenge that calls them to respond, to look back intently. And this is something that really facilitates a marking and a measuring of the prince and his cultural signifiers, which was mentioned just a moment before. The character's description of his triumph over the Persian prince, the Egyptian Sophie, and the Ottoman Sultan Solomon certainly positions him in the geopolitical terrain of the early modern Islamic world. And these allusions are complemented by the prince's later references to Arabia. The extensive interactions taking place between England and the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire in Persia meant that many of the early modern English were familiar with the religious identities of these geopolitical powers. Additionally, theatergoers would have recognized the Islamic faith of these rulers from other plays, including perhaps most famously Marlowe's Chamberlain, which is renowned for kickstarting the 16th century English trend of staging Muslims in plays. The play includes an Ottoman emperor, an Egyptian sultan, the king of Morocco, and the king of Arabia, who highlight their Islamic identities throughout the dialogue with references to God, the Quran, and Muhammad. There are no similar religious references in The Merchant of Venice. Instead, the audience are called to understand the Moroccan prince's Islam via geopolitical association. By suggesting that the prince's proximity to Muslim powers in the Mediterranean is what constitutes and represents his Muslim identity, the play uses a signifier that collapses religion into geography, thereby erasing the theological essence of Islam and correspondingly racializing the space-based group. The effects of this racialization extends beyond the Prince of Morocco or the confines of Shakespeare's play. The grouping together of these Muslim powers will impact the way audiences construe all peoples of these geographies. As Garner and Sellett explain, quote, racialization draws a line around all the members of the group, instigates groupness, and ascribes characteristics based on factors such as work, ideologies, beliefs, and social or cultural organization. The basis of such racialization is not always rooted in groups all looking vaguely the same, but it is the unity of the gaze itself that groups them together. So as these critics contend in their studies of contemporary Islam, those who produce, absorb, and reproduce representations of Muslims can, quote, transform the clearly culturally and phenotypically dissimilar individuals into a homogeneous block. The unified gaze here is that of the predominantly white audience, English audience, and the Belmont audience on stage, who implicitly join the Muslim powers together by a relationship to Islam which is effectively empty of meaning. At the same time, the Morocco's Muslim identity is marked by his scimitar, which he shows Portia in an attempt to prove his strength. In early modern England, scimitars and similar curved blades were associated with Turks and other Muslim figures and thus became used to symbolize Muslim identity on stage. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the performance of a playlet, which was based on a story of cruelty and desire, Ottoman cruelty and desire, staged in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. The director within the play insists that a Portuguese prince who's performing a Turkish character uses a Turkish cape, a black mustachio, and a fortune, which is another sword with a curved blade. The fortune here can turn an actor not only into a Turk, but given the connotations of Turk in the period, turns the actor specifically into a Muslim, making the sword a visual representation of Islamic identity. Although swords are removable props that do not represent permanent or essential markers of physical difference, as Garner and Sillett observe, physical bodies are still the ultimate site of racism, even if the path towards those bodies lies through cultural terrain. The Prince of Morocco's sword works the same effect as it operates as an item of clothing that connects the prince to early modern ideas of a militant Muslim identity. Moreover, in the context of performance of race on the early modern stage, where clothing and costume are used to create phenotypical racialized differences like skin color, as Ian Smith has shown in his work on performance, the lines between costume and prop and body, or costume or prop and body, are blurred, or they're troubled, and it really encourages the stage therefore encourages a reading of such connections. As such, the accessorizing sword implicitly attached to the Prince of Morocco's person has a racializing function, as it maps religious difference onto the Muslim's body. Crucially, the racializing signifiers Shakespeare employs to mark Muslim identity are both aligned to ideas of violent aggression. The prince's proximity to the Muslim world is described through his attacks on the Egyptians, Ottomans, and Persians, and his scimitar itself is a weapon or an instrument of warfare. Therefore, in representing Islam through these cultural tropes, the playwright erases or indeed simplifies Islam into symbols that feed into early modern discourses of terror embodied in a Muslim whose religion is defined by an inherent culture of violence and who must as a result be feared. The dual active process of marking that takes place in the Merchant of Venice is intrinsic to forming practices of racially profiling Muslims, which seems to descend almost directly from these trends of pre-modern racialization. The playwright's use of cultural symbols to characterize the strange traveling prince as a Muslim resonates strikingly with the racial profiling of Muslims that has become prevalent in international travel because of counter-terror campaigns designed in the global north. Post 9/11, international travel became and remains one area where the racial aspects of these practices are tangible as crew members and airport security around the world read Muslim bodies. As Irina Gruhl has shown, quote, signs that make a person appear threatening to travel staff include Muslim names, Sikh turbans and ceremonial knives, a t-shirt with Arabic writing across the chest, and olive-skinned bodies. These signs are uncannily similar to those Muslim-like characteristics that the Merchant of Venice gives to its traveling prince, to invite us to understand this character as a threatening Muslim foreigner and an undesirable African stranger trying to enter into the European world of the play. Like the modern black Muslim traveler, the prince's religious difference and the threat embodied in this difference is marked by his name, Morocco, clothing and accessories, his scimitar, National Geographic associations, Arabia and the Mediterranean, and skin color, his tawny, shadowed livery. More recently still, performances like those staged on the early modern English stage seem to have found their way into policing and security cultures in England, even contemporarily. One example of this, which I found really striking, was a sketch that was incorporated into but soon removed from the curriculum for the UK Metropolitan Police's Crime Academy for the training of new detectives in the UK. This just took place a few months ago, actually. I think it was only removed from the curriculum in July of 2022. The sketch portrayed the violence, greed, and lust of a powerful Muslim Turkish gangster who, though based in the UK, operates in a world of foreigners and persons of color, and those from marginalized and minority ethnic groups. Notably, there's no white persons in this sketch or this performance. Included in his crime, in the Turkish gangster's crimes are his killing of an East Asian moneylender, which he does using a gurkha, which is a curved knife, and his acts of physical and sexual assault against his Indian girlfriend who works with her Indian family. The character uses Islamic law or the Sharia to validate his acts of cruelty. And according to an article published in the Sunday Times, the Met's Crime Academy and retired officers, including a former diversity leader, helped draft and approve the case study, which also includes incest, throat slitting, self-mutilation, and attacks on a disabled child. The article also suggests that similar kinds of content had been incorporated into earlier curriculums in the past, and of course those passed without question. In its basic form, this dramatic work has all the makings of an early modern English drama on Muslim, and here specifically on Ottoman and Turkish identity. This gruesome narrative, which centers on an unruly, powerful Muslim man, is basically the same tale which is told in various versions by various dramatists in England from the late 16th to the mid-17th century. Plays like Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine Robert Greene's The Tragical Reign of Selimus, John Mason's The Turk, and numerous others reflect these narratives. Each of them tells a tale of a powerful Muslim presenting figure, typically an Ottoman sultan who commits acts of tyranny and desire that establish this figure as terrifyingly dangerous. These are men who kidnap and rape women, either individually or in groups, who kill, they commit patricide, fratricide, and filicide, and they oppress their populations because of a blind desire for power. Their acts are also usually accompanied by either the figure's celebration of Islam's enabling of evil acts, a sacrilegious abandonment of Islam in favor of a self-aggrandizing idolatry, or the absence of any sense of Muslim faith altogether. Although the sketch emphasizes a misinterpretation of Islam that resonates more with some of the early modern English texts, rather than the other early modern English texts I referenced above, rather than the same kind of absence we see in The Merchant of Venice. What was interesting to me about this sketch was some of its very clear resonances between those cultural signifiers I suggested earlier, from the Turkish man's location in a broadly marginalized Muslim community, right down to the detail of the gurkha or the curved knife. Although the sketch was thankfully removed from teaching due to the resistance of lecturers, this didactic piece of performance, which, as I said, was put together only a few months ago, is a testament to the connections between early modern English constructions of Islamophobia and those that exist in our everyday. And in closing, I want to tease out the term stranger, which I want to use one more time here to pose a very general question to the audience, one which can be addressed after this, or just to ruminate on. But I really kind of wanted to, this is something that I've been thinking about, which is what is at stake for other identity groups in the racialization of Islam and the injustice that Islamophobia breeds or breeded through Islamophobia, both in the pre-modern world and in the genealogies of its racial practices. I present as a prompt here a statement that the UK-based poet and activist Suhaima Manzoor Khan, or you might know her as the brown hijabi, makes in her recent book, Tangled in Terror, in which she asserts that Islamophobia is not a problem for Muslims alone and cannot be tackled on its own. It's not a single issue struggle, but a problem for the world related to all racisms, all forms of oppression, border violence, policing, war, environmental catastrophe, gender-based violence, and injustice. The standard narrative about Islamophobia hides that it's less about Muslims than it is about everything else. And the question really comes out of my concern with, and also my complete solidarity with the recent protests in Iran following the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini for wearing the hijab inappropriately. And these events have shored up some really kind of some odd and problematic commentaries on Islamophobia, but also some important truths about gender-based violence and the use of the hijab as a policing mechanism for organizing women's bodies and Muslim women's bodies. And so this is just something that I wanted to leave you to take away with. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks so much for that. I think my question kind of comes out of, as you sort of towards the end sort of listed a few other outside of Merchant of Venice examples of the representations of folks from the Islamic world, we'll say, in early modern England. And I'm one thing I've always been curious about, and I think your sort of attention to the sword has reminded me of, is the sort of ways, I think it was Richard Slotkin, I don't really remember where I first read it, the sinister aesthetics that come along with sort of watching the tyrant at work, watching the masterfulness of somebody from in Tamburlaine, of course, sort of watching Tamburlaine go on and on, watching sort of the adeptness and the sort of the bloviating of the Moroccan prince, etc. And I was wondering if this sort of is, as you're sort of tracing this, the obsession that comes along with Islamophobia, right? This fixation. If there's sort of an affectual element to sort of how you're understanding these representations, this sort of like fascination, this sort of can't turn your eyes away, loving to watch the garb that looks so different, this sort of the weaponry that looks so different, and this sort of desire, this enjoyment that comes along with it. It's sort of an odd kind of scary enjoyment.
Yeah, definitely. It's like horror, like they're obsessed, but it's got this kind of thrill. No, it's definitely, that's a really interesting question. I haven't looked too much into, that's a really lovely question, a really generative question for me, because I haven't thought about affect in that way, in terms of this horror sensibility or this aesthetic of like the desire to see this kind of cruelty or extremity. But I think two things that come to mind as a sort of response to that. The one is, what's really interesting, just as a kind of a further reflection, is the way that the English are often want to kind of embody this identity. So even when they, so in a play like Robert de Born's The Christian Turned Turk, for example, there's a character, John Ward, and he sort of converts to Islam. But even before he converts to Islam, he's this renegade English pirate. There's a lot of kind of mapping of this Ottoman tyranny onto the character. And another example is there's a play called The Lovesick King, which is based on like a medieval, and not medieval, it's on sort of England's history on Nut, right? So the kind of I think it's medieval history, but it's based on a narrative. It's based on one of the narratives that's used in a lot of these other tales of an Ottoman man who falls in love with his captive. And so I think something that's really interesting at work is not just that there's an aesthetic of horror and like a desire to kind of see the cruelty and then also to kind of thrill at it, but actually what's kind of creepy is that, or unsettling, is the desire to embody it and to kind of insert themselves into those dynamics. And then the other thing I would say is, in terms of affect, something that I have been thinking about a lot is the way in which Black persons are used in a lot of these plays to create an affect of, to create a mood of evil. So that there's a lot of like imagery of, there's a lot of, so even in this play, for example, in Robert de Born's The Christian Turned Turk, or John Mason's The Turk, there's these allusions to Black women who are metaphors for the sky. And they're just these kind of aesthetic images that are there. And so I think that there's something to be said about what Kim Hall and others have spoken about in terms of the fetishization of Blackness and how that kind of functions in the background affectually. Like that is something I've been thinking about in terms of affect in these plays, like how the mood that gets, how Black bodies are used to create a kind of mood that I think works in towards the racialization and demonization of Islam, and sort of how these two are in conversation with one another. Thank you for the question.
Just wanted to say thank you as well so much for the powerful presentation. So I'm not as learned in like literary studies, so my question is going to be more historical, if that's okay. I was just thinking of the context when some of this stuff is being written, and just kind of, for lack of a better term, 17th century geopolitics and this idea of British alliance with Morocco and the kind of more substantive movement of people, diplomats, whoever else. And this idea you mentioned about British people wanting to kind of, you just said it just now, like kind of live out the experience, exactly, to embody it. So to what extent is this kind of increased contact because of British and Moroccan interests, and then kind of the pirating against Spanish, like this kind of embodying going on in terms of context that's changing? How does that maybe factor in, or and impact this kind of Islamophobia on the one hand, but wanting to embody the other on the other? I don't mean to use other in that way, but
no, I know what you mean. Thank you. That's a really good question. Actually, in the expanded version of this article, I have a whole section on the kind of historical relationship between Morocco and England, and basically how clearly the English understood that Morocco was Muslim as a nation. So like Shakespeare actually never refers to the Prince of Morocco as a Moor in the play itself, but he has the vocabulary of Moor because there's a Moor in the play, but he talks about this prince as a Moroccan. And so I just think that's really interesting because it implies a certain, it implies a kind of connection to Islam that Moor doesn't always allow, because Moor is kind of more of a stretched out term. But that's tangential to your question. As a more direct response, I think, I've just brought up this painting because this is obviously a painting of one of the ambassadors. This is Muhammad al-Nuri, who comes to the UK in 1600. I think that I think that some of this Islamophobia emerges out of, or not Islamophobia, I think some of this Islamophobia that I'm interested in terms of erasure is coming out of a desire to sanitize the Moroccans, because of an anxiety around wanting to be like the Moroccans. So I think definitely that this kind of not talking about Islam in the play, there's some aspect of it which is to do with we're just going to not acknowledge that they are, and that happens in other geographies as well. So, for example, in the Indonesian archipelago, which is the Baccanate Sultanate, I think that's how you pronounce it. But there's also in the kind of letters or the way that the English kind of speak to this geography of people, it's also kind of it raises a very explicit. They basically know that these people are that this country or this nation is very Muslim, but and they have letters which are available and which there's just contact there, but they just don't. They purposefully kind of write it out of the historical chronicles, and they replace it with a kind of paganism or a nature worshipping, and I think that's coming out of the Portuguese role in Indonesia and how that there's already a kind of an imperial dynamic that work there, and I think that the English are riffing off that in an interesting way. So I don't know if I have the clear answer to your question, but I would say that certainly that the historical interactions between Muslims and the English it definitely feeds into a lot of the stuff, a lot of the ways in which Islam gets represented. And I think some of it stretches beyond. I think some of it has its own genealogies in the past, like in terms of the notion of the Saracen, for example, which is a medieval category. So I think it's a combination of those historical realities in the period and then earlier. Is that? Thank you.
Hi, Hassana. Thank you for that wonderful talk. And I want to acknowledge, too, at the onset, just the final quotation that you left us with and allowing us to think about, how the implications of Islamophobia, right, on this broader level, and really to think about the structures of white supremacy, right, that affect us all. And so it was really wonderful to see you putting that into conversation with contemporary understandings. And my question is a little bit about that. And I'm thinking of Ayana's recent call, right, where she talks about putting a pause on stagings of particular plays, right, including The Merchant of Venice for its anti-Semitism. I'm wondering if you are considering contemporary Shakespearean productions or adaptations and the representations of that. So just even looking at the image that you offered, right, how that perpetuates these notions of terror.
Thank you. So I don't particularly. So I included those because I've taught on those, I was hoping somebody might ask me about those because I had really generative responses from the students. But I don't focus on them. I don't focus on the contemporary as much, but it is something I've been thinking about. I thought about a lot for this particular talk in thinking about genealogies and how this kind of translates on stage. And so this image, for example, I would say that there isn't really a sense of terror that gets captured in this figure. Not since at least, I think there was a production in 1991, which was the Royal Shakespeare Company does a production, and the Prince of Morocco comes on stage with he looks like, I don't know the weapon terminology. See, this is how bad I am as a Muslim. I don't know the terminology, but it looks like those bullets that are like you have for a machine gun, which he has around his body, and he's got a thobe, and he's got not a topi, a turban. So he looks like he looks like he's just come out of some Taliban training camp, and that's kind of like, that's the one that comes to mind in terms of the narratives of terror. But some of these other ones are not so, they don't really engage with the framework in that same way, but I think it's because the Prince of Morocco is often relegated as quite a comic figure in the play, and so I think that the people tend to, I think that's part of the danger, or not the danger, I think that's why this character's been overlooked by contrast, for example, to Othello. Like, I've always found this character particularly intriguing because he talks so much and he's there. And I mean, yeah, so in terms of contemporary performance, this was a really interesting image because students told me that they thought the prince looked like Muhammad Ali here, and it was thinking about a kind of transatlantic history. And I was thinking about the fact that Muslims don't gamble, and so the setting of this play was in Las Vegas. And so there's a really interesting, but he's a boxer, so he's kind of a fighter, so he doesn't really gamble. He's not sort of given the kind of competitiveness, but he's almost a performer, or like somebody who's just, I mean, there's a kind of aspect of fighting to him, but it seems a little bit comical and out of place. And then the other one, this just looks like it looks very kind of generic. It looks like a kind of image you see on it looks like an image of an Arab if you would conceptualize it in your head, which I'm not sure. I think that also develops a kind of. I think that that any stereotypical images of Arabs in this way would, to some degree, feed into Islamophobic discourses because of how generally Arabs are stigmatized in culture. But I don't know if this, because I don't focus on it that much, I wasn't sure if this production was consciously doing it. But actually, somebody once asked me how I would imagine staging this character now, and in a way to kind of counteract some of these discourses. And it's something that I was just thinking about this morning. And I don't know, but for me, it would be something like the character prays on stage before he comes up, or I don't know, some way of recognizing, which it wouldn't even fully counteract, but I think at least what it would address is a sense that there's a theology there, and that's being erased from this character, and sort of trying to write that back into the character. Thank you for the question.
Hi, I just want to echo everyone else and say thank you so much for this. It was so interesting and so informative. My question is kind of about some of these markers of the racialization process. And I know in medieval drama, one of the markers of this process is often like parodic language use. So like taking Latin and skewing it and calling it kind of a Muslim language, or doing a church service in that way. And I wonder if you see that in any of these early modern plays as part of this process and this Islamophobia happening.
That's really interesting. That's interesting. That's a medieval trend. I think one play where this kind of comes up is, I don't see it in any, I think there are references, there are certainly references to the Quran in many of these plays, not many, a handful of these plays. There isn't an engagement with the Latin of the Quran, but there is a play called Friar Bacon, Friar Bangay, which is a play by Robert Greene, and the play features and it has on the cover of the play text an old Muhammad's head, which is basically this. It's this idol that gets used in plays to signal Muhammad. So it's I think that many of the theatre companies had it in their kind of possession. And so Friar Bacon, Friar Bangay is a play about magic and sorcery. And so there's this head on stage that remains on stage, but there is there's a lot of this Latin and idolatry and heathenism that's kind of dealt with in that play. And so though Islam itself is not explicitly engaged within the play, the presence of the Muhammad's head there, which is this kind of icon of religion, does suggest that there's a kind of extension of that. So that's very interesting. And that's quite an early play, actually. I think it's 1589. So I can see how that would draw from the medieval tradition, or be an extension of that. Thank you.
So I have a question for you that's kind of something that I've been toying with for a decade, and I finally have someone I can ask. So there's a moment in John Bulwer's Anthropometamorphosis, and you'll be shocked, it's about ink.
No.
But he says that because of a vitriolous condition, Moors might possibly become Negroes. And this is another one of those, because they've got sort of ink ingredients in their composition, chemical reactions could possibly turn Moors into Negroes. And so I've just been wondering about this in relation to the tendency for stage Moors to be Black. And I've also been sort of hypothesizing that there's an attempt to possibly, because as you know, the scholarship, with the exception of Umberine Databoy, has tried to divorce representations of Islam from representations of Black people, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you might have something to say about the kind of conjoining of those two figures. And so my own kind of theory is that if, as so many people have told us, the English know that they can't compete with the Ottoman Empire. The English know that they're commercially and militarily, overmatched. But because of, in terms of, in relation to Moors, that Negroes who've entered the language through the Spanish as subordinate, that like that possibly these stage representations allow for this same transformation that Bulwer is talking about, like turning Moors into Negroes and thereby debasing them. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that does happen. Well, I think I have one example where that definitely happens, but it's not quite a turning of a Moor. It's a turning of a Turk into a Moor, which is something to that, but definitely a Moor that's characterized as black, phenotypically black. So this is a poem that I write about in my thesis. It's called it's Muhammad and Hiram by William Barksdale. And it's based on this kind of narrative I was talking about earlier, which is the story of an Ottoman emperor, Muhammad. It's basically a historical narrative. No, it's not historically true. It's sort of historically inspired, based on the aftermath of the conquest of Constantinople. And so this play by Barksdale, the poem by Barksdale, and Barksdale's an actor. So I think he's in one of the playing companies, and he writes this poem, and he, up until this point, this narrative tradition, so the story of Muhammad and Hiram as it's been written in kind of these paratexts to the stage. So in William Painter's The Palace of Pleasure and Richard Knowles' History of the Turks, up until this point, the story has been told with a Turk who's racialized in terms of his lineage, so no kind of reference to his phenotype or his body in any way. And Barksdale then transforms this character into a phenotypically black character, and what he does then is he uses this figure metaphorically in a way that that corresponds with how Kim Hall describes Kim Hall and Peter Erikson. Peter Erikson also does a lot of this work on how black persons feature in paintings. So Barksdale's got this particular image that he talks about how the Turk becomes like a complement to Hiram, the white Hiram, and he becomes like he's like a black shawl that goes over her shoulder, and like just the image that kind of gets created through this poem is something that's very resonant with what Hall describes in the way in which blackness is kind of commodified, and then that becomes a kind of power play which is used to create whiteness, to create like sort of white supremacy, and so there's definitely this blackening of the Turk in that play. In terms of the relationship between Moor and Negro, I think that's also really interesting because I don't think there's always, I think there's actually something of a distinction between them. I think so. What happens is, so in a play like Tamburlaine, for example, Tamburlaine includes a few black characters, and a couple of those are there's a reference to Moors and there's a reference to a Negro, and the Negro is described as pulling a carriage like a horse, and the Moors are described as being in the army. But they also kind of compare to the horse in a similar way because of the way the play sets up. Horses in that play function as a kind of, basically the Moors are kind of made analogous to the horses in that they support the army, and they sort of described in abundance, and they used to kind of give power to all the white presenting or white adjacent other Muslims. So Tamburlaine, for example, is sort of whitish, he's pale. The others aren't described phenotypically, but the sense is that they're white. And then the Prince of Morocco, in that instance, is not explicitly characterized as a Moor, but when there's a discussion of his kind of warriors, they are Moors. And then, so I think to answer your question, I think there's definitely some work in the transformation of white to black, or dark to kind of black, and I think that there's also kind of an understanding that the Muslim world's got its own engagements with racial dynamics, and that there's a variety there. And already Negroes are at the bottom of that scale in that kind of context, I don't know if that answers your question.
If I may, I would like to ask a question. So by the way, this was a great talk. And of course your talk is about the Prince of Morocco, but I was wondering if you could comment on the portrayal of Muslim women in early modern plays? Because off the top of my head, I believe, I think like Island Princess, I think it involves, this like, Muslim, woman who is then converted, to Christianity. And so I often associate, on the early modern stage, the presence of Muslim women as being sort of this, they embody this fantasy of conversion. And I wonder if, if you have anything to kind of say about that, or, maybe contrast that to the way that Muslim men are portrayed on the stage.
Thank you. That's a really nice question. And that's actually something I was working on relatively recently, not on Muslim women, but thinking about the comparison between Muslim women and Muslim men. Because, so as you mentioned, that there's a sense that Muslim women can be brought into the fold of Christianity. And this is a medieval trend, right? So it's something that dates like much further back. To like the Romance narratives, and even before, this idea that a white or a fair Muslim woman can become Christian and sort of can become brought into the system. I think what's interesting is that because of that, there are more anxieties that get bred out of the sort of comparison between a white English man and then a white Ottoman man. I mean, obviously there's the gender dynamics at work there, but just sometimes what happens is in order to articulate the whiteness, or in order to articulate white greatness over white Muslim adjacency, Christian English have to use white Christian woman against white adjacent Muslim men. But they obviously don't do that. They don't have that same anxiety around white adjacent Muslim women. Yeah, but that's a really good question. Essentially, there's just usually two types of Muslim women on stage. Usually, there's a kind of a white presenting Muslim woman. Not always. This is not. There's two kind of particular trends that frequently appear on stage. One is a kind of white woman who can be converted, and the other is who's usually a person in service. So those are the two kind of key figures. But yeah, in terms of my reflection on the differences, I think in terms of whiteness, there's really some interesting work that happens there, and some distinctions you can see in terms of how these figures are characterized. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for the questions. And if you can join me in thanking Hassana Moosa for her wonderful talk.